Hello and welcome. It is Vintage Super League Finals time. How are you feeling about this, Tom?
I'm pretty excited. Get to watch the two best performers this season square off head to head, and I mean both Chris and Erica had tremendous seasons, so I'm excited to watch them play.
Do you have any predictions for the finals?
I mean, it's hard to bet against Efro. He's on a heater right now. Chris has been iced on the sidelines last 3 weeks or 2 weeks, I guess, so hasn't been playing much, and I was coming off of a disappointing PTQ performance yesterday, so I think the everything's kind of lining up on Efro's side for momentum.
So you think Chris is rusty with the 2 week layoff? That's what you're worried about?
I mean, I think it definitely factors in, right? You got to kind of find narrow edges when it comes to something like this. So
So my bold prediction is that Chris will do better than either I or Luis did. My
I,
prediction is for match number 4. That's the limb I'm going out on. At least 4 matches in Magic. Hopefully 5.
I'd love to see 5 games, 5 matches here. I mean, obviously, more vintage is great, and especially given kind of the anticlimactic matches we saw in the last 2 weeks, where Efro kind of just rolled you guys. You couldn't really get anything going. No fault of your own or Luis's. There wasn't a lot of play to those matches. So
He's been playing great, made good deck choices, and so that is where we've got 1 hour between now and the beginning of the matches. Chris, I know, has landed back in Philadelphia from his regional PTQ trip. He's furiously typing in his deck lists and getting those off to us. What we've got scheduled for the next hour, though, is I thought it might be nice just to do a little season in review. Take a look at how it is that we got to this Efro versus Chris Pakula final battle. Tom hasn't seen a lot of this, but we'll go along for the ride. So
I got to live it, Randy. I lived it.
you did
I
live it.
don't think
That's
I've
true.
actually appeared in any of these because my season was very uneventful, but I was at least around when these things were going on.
You're,
So
you're going to make a cameo at the end, or if you do your specialty of the 3-0 in the last trimester to avoid relegation. Seems to be your specialty, right?
becoming that way, yeah.
Um, week 1, you got any memories?
Week one, I mean, there was obviously the first turn one kill we saw, which I forget because of I get subject to one later in the season. But yeah, I think that was definitely the highlight of the first week.
Yeah, so week 1, I think the highlight was definitely, it was the first ever turn 1 kill in league history. And that is the video we've got queued up momentarily. Blue Belcher, I think, was the big storyline. I had played that a little bit in some vintage events on Magic Online. Chris was the guy who wanted to run it and started fiddling around with my deck list. And I was at first helping him play test it, but then he found multiple cards that I thought just improved the list. So the Blue Belcher deck actually managed to go 3-0 in week 1 because I played twice because Kai had issues with internet. He was traveling to the Pro Tour. I actually
Yep.
played 2 matches. Figured my whole season was kind of downhill from the 2-0 start, but one of those matches was the first turn 1 kill in league history. So let's play the tape and reminisce.
That's probably a good one. Luis's hand here is really strong. It doesn't have a force of will, but because he's on the play,
Yeah,
it's
that is a
also
good
able
start again.
to leverage that Thoughtseize.
Yeah, I mean, he's got probe to know whether he wants the Thoughtseize right away or whether he has
survive
time
the
to
Thoughtseize.
preordain. I guess it also depends on what he draws off of it. Obviously, if he's able to draw like a green mana source, he's able
I didn't realize you turned one through the Thoughtseize. That's absurd.
Now,
Yep.
on the other hand, Randy has the Academy in his starting hand, and
That is huge for this deck.
all of my
31% sure.
Yeah, this deck is sweet.
approaches to
Yeah, and
this
Luis is
battle
looking at it going, there's no business
are
here.
predicated
I guess I
on
just
getting
take the
back from that.
preordain and cross my fingers.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you take the preordain and cross
Did you
your
end up
fingers.
running a copy of Strip Mine in your deck?
I didn't. I played 3 Dig Through Time and 2 Snapcaster Mage, and I ended up playing an additional mana source. Clearly,
Do you think that's right, or should you take Black Lotus?
But
I think he was correct to take
I needed
preordain.
to add more mana, and in particular more blue mana, to make the deck work with.
It seems like this hand doesn't really need the Lotus
So Luis
with the Academy already there.
Preordain after
Exactly.
seeing a hand that just had 1,000,000 mana. All the mana in the world, honestly, for Randy. If he draws a threat, though, the game just ends on the spot.
Yes.
Yeah, so look at Luis's hand. Not
Yeah, Blue Belcher definitely one of I think the highlights really overall of the entire
Four,
VSL
box five,
season,
Academy
not just the first
is
3
gonna
week
be able to
split.
tap for at least 4 mana.
Yeah.
I know in this trimester, I expected actually to play against it at least once, and I thought that I had trumped it with my sideboard plan, and turned out I was just very wrong. So it was a rude awakening for me.
Oh, absolutely.
It's okay. So
Come on, Preordain. You can do it.
Emptying his hand fully. Preordain looking to find. He's got a lot of things he can get. Belcher wins on the spot. Tezzeret's great. Mind's Desire's great. Diminishing Returns. Time Twister.
Do you remember? Did you have
Sure.
to bottom and peel, or did you find it right there?
So,
I found it.
Tezzeret. Okay, I believe this game's over. I think.
Yeah, as soon as I saw Tezzeret, I
realized
knew the
that
game was
instead
over.
of getting Time Vault as is his custom, he's just going to grab a Belcher and.
Yeah, the additions of the Tezzeret really, I think, improved the list.
Belcher's workshops, he'll just.
I think your first version of the deck didn't have Tezzeret. I think you added the Tezzeret yourself, right?
I added the Tezzeret, that's right, and then Chris added the Diminish.
And that's what I didn't know about. I only saw your very first list that didn't have those.
Yep.
I thought your only kill was Belcher. So I had Leyline of Sanctity thinking I trumped you, and then, yeah, not so much.
Yeah, no, that deck was awesome. So you think that deck is the story of VSL from a deck point of view, Tom?
I mean, probably it's the really it either be that or Monastery Mentor, right, which we saw evolve during the course of the season. But this is the deck that I think by far has had the largest impact. It's very powerful. It came in, it got played a lot in the league to great results.
I agree. I actually think the Doomsday deck also did quite well in the league, which we've got queued up. It took us 50-some matches to get to our first turn 1 kill in league history, but it only took one more week to get to the second turn 1 kill in league history.
So I do make an appearance. I forgot.
Although, to be fair, we didn't have any. This is it. We only had the 2 this season, so we've now played 200+ games. I haven't gone back to count how many game 3s there were, but I mean, it's been 90 regular season matches plus playoff matches. We still only have the 2 turn 1 kills. The second of which was Luis with Doomsday in week 2. So let's roll the tape on that one. About which? Us or?
Original commentary.
Oh, so it's just us. Got it. Yeah, so Luis came out with this Doomsday deck. I think the Doomsday deck is just great. I mean, the deck is... It's got all the good blue cards that we all like to play with, and then it just occasionally kills people out of nowhere, right?
I think this deck is so the only reason why I didn't give this the nod is I think this was a deck that existed. Obviously Menendian played it last season. I thought Belcher really much more, I think, defined by VSL, but I could be mistaken. Maybe there was just a very well-known deck in the community beforehand.
Yeah, no, the Belcher deck was floating around the fringes. I mean, part of the reason I think Belcher did so well in VSL is that it's a metagame deck that's super vulnerable to shops. And I felt like shops was going to be underplayed. The Doomsday deck, I think, it's certainly the more resilient deck. And here you see Luis he's got a fast bond, he's got a gush. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, here's the Doomsday kill, right?
Yep, there I go, off to my start.
Well, you played Dredge. Of course you're going to lose. You're playing the Dredge deck, right?
It's great. I threw it last season.
That was it.
The counterpoint to this year, right, is Dredge being 09 or 010, I guess, or 011, whatever it is at now.
Yeah.
The counter running. Obviously, massively underperforming its power because it is a great deck. It was losing to decks that weren't even packing hate for it. It was, Ephro lost to me when I had 2 sideboard cards. So I think it just, was definitely the flip side of the storyline, which I respect. We get to see the evil villain Dredge taken down by the good guys of any other deck in the format, which I'm okay with.
Fair. Yeah, no, it certainly has been an interesting storyline. And here, I guess, good guy Doomsday with the Brainstorm. I mean, Luis had everything this draw. He even has a Time Walk in his hand that he doesn't even bother to use. Right? I mean, he could fast bond his land. He could time walk to bootstrap his way into this Doomsday pile. No need. I'll just Brainstorm, and then I'll Ancestral. Now he's got the Laboratory Maniac, and he's got no deck. So there you go. Gush for the win.
So, what we don't see here is in the other game in this match, Luis turn 2s me with a Leyline of the Void in play on turn 1. So I took a total of 1 turn over the 2 games. Which was close. It was a really close match. There's really anyone could have won.
Welcome to Vintage, right? So I've actually got the standings queued up for the first trimester and kind of take stock of where we were at this point in the season. You see that the Delver deck is sitting at 3-0 in Eric's hands, but Delver actually had every possible record. It went 3-0, it went 2-1, it went 1-2, and it went 0-3.
That's awesome.
Yeah, but yeah, the Belcher deck did well, and you forget about that Crucible Gushbond deck that Bob was playing. That actually put up a 2-1. Nobody ever came back to it, but a bunch of 2-1s, and then the Dredge decks holding up the bottom, giving lots of free wins out to the rest of the world.
Well, yeah, I think the Crucible Gushbond deck, more of a pet project for Bob. I think not really the power level of a staple in Vintage. Probably one of the weaker decks I think overall that was played. But you can if it has the broken cards in it, you can kind of build any shell you want around that, and it'll be playable.
Yeah,
I think Bob was making that point here with this deck.
I think that's fair. So moving into the sort of middle third of the season, week 4 for me was all about the rematch between Steve and Luis.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember that game?
I do. Yeah, I mean I think we saw this actually a couple times in matches between them where the game just goes super long and it looks like Luis is just completely dead, and you see kind of a crazy comeback, which we're going to see here in this game where it looks like Luis just has no business being in the game at this point.
Pretty much, yeah. Steve has a hand of 5 counters and a couple of card drawing spells. If you go back and listen to the original commentary, and it's hilarious in retrospect because of course the game is all Steve's. Luis has just no business being in this game somehow. Grafdigger's Cage is shutting down any Oath shenanigans. He does have the show and tell for the Emrakul, but he's Gitaxian probed Steve, so he knows there's no way that he's ever going to be able to resolve any of that.
Yep.
The Miser's Emrakul, though, was a sideboard card that Luis brought in thinking, okay, so this is game 2. Steve's got the Mentor deck. He knows the Mentor deck's going to have Source of Plowshares in the first game, but is it going to have Plows in game 2? Maybe 1, right?
Yeah, for the Elishnorn answer, yeah. So it definitely makes Elishnorn a trump in the matchup when all the swords are gone.
Yeah, definitely. And this is a week 4 where Steve doesn't know Luis's actual deck list, so it's one of those where Luis is like, maybe I can catch him. Still, though, how's he supposed to win this game, right? 8 cards in Steve's hand. 3 of them are Pirate Blast. 2 of them are Force of Will. 2 Gushes and a Dig Through Time. So 5 counter spells and 3 card drawing cards. And this is on the heels of when these guys played in Season 1 in the regular season, Steve actually managed to misdirect Luis's Ancestral Recall to himself. And yet Luis just waited and waited and waited and eventually managed to maneuver the game around to a point where he could win.
Well, here you can see, I think already we're seeing Steve discarding Pyroblast is just a mistake there. I think you really want to discard Gush and keep your, or alternatively, play one of the Gushes and just replay a land and just try to get some action into your hand, because the way Luis is going to win this game is the game just goes 30 turns and he's going to claw his way back into it.
Well, what Steve decides to do is to go for an end step Dig Through Time. So this is Steve targeting Luis with Dig Through Time on Luis's end step, and Luis knows he's got to go for it now. I mean, he knows that Steve's got the grip full of gas, but all right, let's see if we can Ancestral Recall his response, right? Steve says no, Mental Misstep counters Pyroblast. And now Steve's problem with the way Steve gets himself into trouble in these games a lot of the time, I think, is he doesn't get enough lands into play.
Right, he bottlenecks himself too much on mana.
Yeah, I think actually earlier in the game, like he tends to discard land to keep counterspells, and I don't know. I always find like we get to the big fight, and now okay, he's got the 2 Force of Wills, but he has to pitch, and Luis is tapping mana for counters. You know, here's a misdirectional Force of Will. At this point, Steve is kind of priced in, right?
Right.
He's decided to fight over this Ancestral. He's the one with the Dig Through Time at the bottom of the stack, but he doesn't have a Volcanic up for this Pyroblast, so...
Yeah, I think he was just too impatient on pulling the trigger on this dig. I guess he kept the second Gush to have another blue card for Force Will, so I take back that. I think that's correct. Just because the Pyroblast was fine. I forgot the ratio of blue cards in his hand. But I think he should just be patient and not fire off the dig until he gets another land in play.
Yeah, and now with Misdirection trying to point Force of Will at Dig Through Time, Steve definitely has to fight, which he does. Again, the Pyroblast is kind of trapped in his hand. Now, the good news for Steve is that he does get to resolve this Dig Through Time.
Right, but like almost all of his permission is gone now, right? He's used it all.
Right.
Like dig into more permission when he's just played 6 permission spells in 1 turn.
Yeah, and you'll see that what he comes up with is a couple of Preordains.
Yeah, at this point, I mean, now he's a big underdog just from picking that one fight. So one fight gone poorly, and forcing him to use multiple 2-for-1 remove answers out of his own hand on those force wills, removing his way to get back ahead.
Now,
Cost of this game.
Now, one funny thing that happens here is that Steve has drawn a wear tear, and we can see the hands, obviously. So we know Luis is holding Elish Norn, and that wear tear targeting Black Lotus would actually prevent the Grand Cenobite from coming down. But there's no way Steve is supposed to just randomly wear tear a Black Lotus, right?
I don't agree with that statement. I mean, at this stage in the game, like, what is Luis holding, right? Like, he has fatties. He's not even. He can almost cast Grizzlebrand at this point too, right?
Yep.
In fact, is
that's
8.
Now,
He
so
can hard cast Grizzlebrand. You absolutely need to wear tear the Black Lotus.
Well, it's easy to say that in retrospect. Maybe you're right. Maybe he was supposed to.
He has Cage in play. He's not worried about the Oath at this stage.
Sure. And Steve has finally found his Monastery Mentor. Doesn't have the mana to put it into play yet. But yeah, after we tune in, while Menendian has 5 counters and 3 card draw spells, and Luis is sitting on like an Ancestral and a Misstep. I guess he had a Misdirection. He's got 2 counters and a couple of uncastable giant creatures. But here we go. Steve Menendian sideboarded out every copy of Swords to Plowshares. So this Elish Norn is permanent, and this Elish Norn means it is impossible for Steve Menendian to deal a single point of damage.
Yep.
Just insane. Just, wow. I mean, after these guys played this game out in match 1, now Steve did get the last laugh in season 1, right? He was the one who beat Luis in the championship match. But, you know, a modicum of revenge here. And Steve's season really just kind of spiraled from here. He wound up finishing 9th overall, whereas Luis made the playoffs.
Yep.
Such a crazy game. I don't know. I thought that was one of the best matches that got played all year. I don't know. Maybe it's just because of, you know, watching the blue matches play out and, you know, watching people sort of jockey for position, and Luis somehow just always manages to play circles around Steve. I mean, Steve's a great player. I don't mean any discredit to Steve, but I mean, Luis is a truly great player. And just the way those matches have lined up, he's been able to sort of maneuver around the way Steve attacks those matchups.
Yeah, I think these are some of the best matchups to watch because the strategic decisions being made have such a large impact on the game. Some percentage of vintage matches, just like we saw with the turn 1 kills, one player doesn't really get to do anything. It's just a show up, you know, highlights the power in the format, and that's fun and flashy. But I personally enjoy watching the games where both players are like taking strategic lines, and one player is able to kind of trump what the other person's doing. Well, in this case, I mean, I don't think Luis really did a lot. He just got to exploit Steve's strategic mistake in trying to force that dig through time end of turn.
Luis does do a lot, but I mean, what he does is he declines to do things. The patience that he shows, if you go back and watch the Menendian matches, I've never sat with Ancestral Recall in my hand for that long, ever. And Luis did it in both this match and the match from last year. He'll just not cast Ancestral Recall, even though you always want to cast Ancestral Recall, right? I want to draw 3 cards.
Sure, and Luis is showing up there understanding, like, when you can bottleneck your opponent on mana, when you have more mana than them, you want to wait and force a bottleneck turn and wait for them to blink. And having played against Steve, this comes up actually in my match against Steve later in the season. Steve's known for he doesn't like to take proactive lines.
Right.
And so I think he's getting better at this. You can see he progresses, but that was, I think, one of his weaknesses. And he starts, so you can exploit that by taking and bottlenecking him in certain spots. Luis does that really nicely in this spot here.
For me, it's one of the awesome things about Vintage that both these games happen, right? You get the threat of the turn 1 kill, but it doesn't happen all that often. I mean, we've happened 1% of our games that come down turn kill. And you also get these crazy awesome control matchups. And then you sometimes get the draw where just everybody's hand obliterates the other guy's hand, and you wind up top decking and games going 10 turns with nobody doing anything, just, you know, attacking with dorks or something.
Absolutely. Vintage just have a really wide set of gameplay, which is why it's so fun.
Oh yeah. So the other thing that was going on at this point in the season was kind of interesting. So that was week 4. We get to week 5, and Kai Buddha had not yet won a single game in the league. He was 0-4-0-8 and down a game against David Williams in his week 5 match. So we can tune in on that. Kai's playing the same Omni Oath deck that we just saw in Luis's hands there against Steve Menendian. And look at David Williams' draw, right? He's up a game in the match. He's got Grafdigger's Cage, which is what you want. He's on the draw with his nut sideboard card, and he kind of gets 2 draw phases because he got Gataxian Probe. You know what else David is? David's a gambler. He's
Yeah,
going to keep that hand. But do you keep that hand in a million years?
I personally probably don't.
And now Kai has a pretty nice draw of his own. He's got Ancestral Recall, which, okay, it gets misstepped. Nice draw, but the misstep does thwart it. Kai also has, I think he's got the Jet and the Emerald, if I'm not. Yeah, he's got the Emerald. So he's able to go Forbidden Orchard, Ancestral Recall, Mox Mox, Oath of Druids, spectacular turn one. Although, if you look at it, it is completely shut down if David can come up with a mana source here. Right?
Sure.
This whole game, this match, arguably both players' season in retrospect comes down to whether Dave Williams can find a mana source, but no! Misses on the draw phase, misses on the Gitaxian Probe. Grafdigger's Cage would completely destroy Kai if he could play it right here.
Yeah, in this case, I mean, Dave obviously got extremely unlucky in that Kai was able to play the turn one Oath as well. So he doesn't get it. He probably was banking on getting one more draw step. He didn't look at 3 cards to try to find a land.
Yeah.
One thing I would just point to is just, I mean, with this sort of hand that we just saw with Steve versus Luis, the real drawback is even if Dave can land this cage, it doesn't win on its own. And he has no way to actually end the game quickly, which will give Kai a chance to really set up a hand.
Yeah, he has to go find show and tell. It is certainly true that one of the advantages of this Omni-Oath list is the fact they can find show and tell.
Right.
And then that means that Cage doesn't single-handedly destroy them. I feel like it would have destroyed Kai with this draw, though.
Certainly, it lined up very well against Kai's draw here, but I think it's the kind of. But even then, so say Dave just puts it into play. I mean, the fact he has top is nice because he gets to buy him some time.
Yeah.
But Kai has a lot of turns to make something happen here, and so that's why I think like the double gamble of you have to draw a land, then you have to draw more lands, then you have to draw action, and you have to hope that Kai doesn't have the show and tell hand already built. Makes me not want to keep that hand.
I'm not saying I would have kept it either. I would not. I would have mulliganed. I respect, though, the gamble.
Oh, absolutely.
The gamble
was a very close hand. It's very
kind of an awesome thing to watch. And now think about how much changes, right? Kai does go on to win game 3, so Kai wins the match. It's Kai's first match win of his VSL career, and he winds up 4-5. So he goes 4-1. This is the first win, 4-1 in the back half. This is his first win. Dave Williams, if Dave draws a land there and wins that game, and I feel like he probably wins the game if he draws a land there, or Mox, any kind of mana.
Sure.
Suddenly, if that's the only thing that changes, we have a 3-way tie for last. We have Williams, Menendian, and Buddha sitting at 3-6, playing to avoid relegation.
Yep.
So yeah. I mean, there's a lot of crazy stuff that goes on in Vintage, and sometimes it can just there's such thin edges. Anyway, I was going back, reminding myself what had happened in the season, and I'd sort of forgotten about that moment, and I went back and watched it, and just thinking about how much actually hinged on it was kind of crazy.
Super thin margins. I mean, make or break a lot of these games.
Yeah.
If you look back, you just go back and just watch a montage of the 9 dredge matches. You'll see at least 4 moments where one player, if they hit their 60 to 80%, or they win with dredge, and all of a sudden, the tide can turn on that direction too. So it's just Vintage is a format where, because the cards are so powerful, you'll get some of these, really coin flippy moments where it's super exciting, and one player, is just kind of made or broken by variance.
Totally true. Probably the bigger thing that was going on in week 5 is we had our last 2 undefeateds paired. Do you remember who the last 2 undefeateds were?
I believe it actually was our finals competitors, right? Eric and Chris.
Indeed. It turned out it was a finals preview. So week 5, the 2 4-0s. Eric Froelich was 4-0. Chris Pakula was 4-0. They were both playing workshop decks, although fairly different takes on the workshop archetype. And yeah, turned out week 5 undefeateds clash was actually a finals preview, and got a little bit. Thought we'd go in a little more depth into that match since it is a finals preview. Game 1 was pretty interesting because one of the differences between the decks was supposed to be the fact that Eric had these terrible Tangle Wires in his deck, whereas Chris had a whole bunch of Phyrexian Metamorphs that could just copy things. But here you see Eric has actually used Tangle Wire to pin Chris down where he can't cast anything. Eric is able to get, he goes for a Worm Coil Engine. He gets a Forge Master into play, uses it to get a Worm Coil Engine he can attack with, and then Worm Coil Engine killed off the Forge Master is actually pretty nice synergy, right? You sack the Worm Coil Engine, busting it up into its parts. And we were thinking at the time, I know that if you listen to the commentary, Luis and Kai are talking about, oh, Chris is going to be able to use Metamorph to copy the Worm Coil engine, and then Eric can sack it as response to Fizzle the Metamorph. But no, Eric is just like, these Tangle Wires are actually just awesome.
Well, Tangle is just so good when you're ahead, right? Because it establishes parity on mana, but your board gets to keep just hitting him.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, because if Chris can keep parity or even get ahead himself, Tangle Wire is really bad because it doesn't help you catch up. But it's great when you're ahead in there. Even really shows off it's kind of power level.
Yeah, you listen to the original commentary there, and Luis is laughing because he's like, oh yeah, Tangle Wire. That's just lethal.
Yeah.
Eric is playing this deck really well. And he was. Eric was finding all the edges. I mean, not a guy who's played a ton of Vintage historically, but he's really embraced the format and doing super well with it.
Absolutely. I mean, Eric's just one of the top 5 Magic players in the world today, and whether it's Standard, Vintage, Modern, Commander, Magic is Magic, and I think he's going to be a top 5 player in any of those categories. And he's showing that off in this season certainly.
You can also watch the season review. You can see his ranking keeps changing. He goes from 11, wins the Grand Prix, top 8's the Pro Tour, goes to 3, goes up, almost top 8's the next Pro Tour. Now he's #1 ranked in the world. So game 2 of this matchup, it's actually Chris who's on the front foot. And it's, again, kind of a tempo-y game in a matchup that often plays out super grindy and super attrition-y. Chris is able to just play Phyrexian Revokers, and he's able to just keep attacking with Phyrexian Revokers. And you can see here, Eric actually has Crucible of Worlds with Wasteland, but he's losing to Manlands just because he got a beat behind. And this Solarian Academy off the top is actually perfect because it allows Chris to fire up both the Mutavault and the Mistress Factory, and just this army of 2/2s and 2/1s is actually more than Eric can deal with fast enough.
Yeah, it's interesting that this game also plays out some tempo. And here we can see the Tangle Wires in Eric's hand doing nothing because he's behind on the board. And so you can see the flip side of why that card is sort of double-edged. And I get to watch Chris just take him out with tempo here and kind of snowball him.
Yeah, Eric is almost able. If Chris hadn't drawn the Academy, it would have been interesting because Eric can maybe wasteland one of the creatures, threaten to block a Revoker with a Factory. Like if Eric had time and/or life, I feel like that Crucible Wasteland might have been able to stabilize this board, but it's pretty interesting how, the Phyrexian Revoker beatdown, and one of those is a Metamorph that I believe Chris paid 3 mana and 2 life for.
Yep.
Sometimes you just need to attack with a 2/1. Yeah, Factory trades to Revoker, but not much Eric can draw from 2 life.
Going to 2s. If he's at 4, he has a chance here. Right, he can just go Wasteland, bring it back Wasteland. But now he only has... If he drew an artifact creature he could cast for 4 mana. So if he drew Lodestone Golem, I think he was fine, right? Yeah, he needed to draw Lodestone Golem there.
Yeah, that's what he had done the previous turn, but Chris had the Dismember.
Yep.
So yeah, I think Eric just lines up his options, and yeah, there aren't any. So 3. And game 3, it was kind of a weird one. The way the game starts out, I'm not going to show the whole tape because it's kind of a long game the way it played out. Yep. What happens is that Eric goes turn 1 Workshop for Crucible. And Chris has Metamorph in his hand, so he's going to be able to copy the Crucible on Eric's side as soon as he gets to 3 mana, but Eric has Crucible with Wasteland, so he's just waste your land, waste your land, waste your land. Look how many lands are in Chris's graveyard, right? Chris actually plays just 10, 11 turns of this game without ever missing a land drop and without ever getting to 3 mana so that he can Metamorph to copy that Crucible.
Well, it eventually needs to be 4, right? Because the Sphere Resistance also comes down.
Sphere of Resistance eventually comes down, yeah. I'm not sure he ever even had 3. I mean, that Revoker is actually turning off the Mox Jet in the picture right here. But yeah, I mean, Wasteland and Strip Mine were kind of like, okay, does Eric want to waste an untapped Wasteland? And at one point the answer was yes, and at other points the answer was no. But yeah, they just play this crazy game where the whole time Eric is just Wasteland recursioning, and Chris is never actually able to play any spells. Yep. You look at his graveyard, and the only spells he ever managed to get onto the stack were that Mox Jet, and I'm pretty sure there's a Dismember sitting in the middle.
He played 1 Dismember at some point.
Yeah, and I mean, if there's a matchup where you can win with just that small spell set, maybe this is the one. But no, Eric's Wasteland Recursion just got the job done. And he actually ends up dropping the Mana Vault just because he's so close to finishing Chris off. That I think this takes a couple more turns, but you get a sense of what was going on in this matchup. So it is Eric who wins. Eric wins that match. That gets him to 5-0. He then goes on to win the next game, the next round as well. He won in week 6, gets all the way to 6-0. And that kind of wrapped. That was kind of the story of our middle trimester. I think was Eric just going nuts.
Yep. There was that also. I think the debut of Mentor as an archetype.
Oh, let's put up the trimester standings because you're right. There was a lot of Mentor played, but I'll be honest, it didn't do particularly well.
Oh no, not at all. But I think that's kind of interesting. This is one of the first times we've seen, an archetype break on VSL. I'm sure it's also happening in parallel, in the real world, the real vintage community. But the card just came out. It came out during our season. So this is really the first time we're trying to pioneer archetypes and build the deck from scratch. And obviously, Mentor not off to a great start here with the lists that our competitors came up with.
Yeah, I found it really interesting. It seemed like it was doing better than that on Magic Online, but every time we played against them, I know that, I beat it with Merfolk a couple of times. Oath is also a pretty bad matchup for Mentor. So, I mean, the matchups for Mentor were bad, but 1-8? 1-8
is the only win, I believe, when I lost to, I think I lost to Dave in this blog with gifts.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah, so he managed to get a win because you showed up with a gifts deck that I know you eventually described as being unplayable.
Oh, it was horrifically bad, but it was kind of fun to play, and so I wanted to try it out.
Oh, I tried out plenty of gifts decks off camera. I wanted it to be good, and it's just a little too expensive, a little too slow relative to everything else that's going on in Vintage right now, I think.
Oh yeah, I think it's not a competitive engine, but it's not that far off, and I could see a world where they print something that might bring it back, but
yeah,
I think it's not the most lucrative spot to be mining for deck ideas.
Yeah, no, the Oath deck, by the way, I don't know that I remember going, oh my god, that Oath deck, but it went 5-1.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Luis 3-0'd and Kai 2-1, so that Oath deck did pretty well too. This brings us to the third trimester, where I feel like there were a couple of storylines in the third trimester. I mean, the playoff race was not particularly interesting. We actually knew all 4 of our playoff competitors early in week 8. We still had a week and a half to go, and it had already been clinched. The only thing left was what's the order. Me, Chris, Luis, and Eric could have wound up in any order, 1 through 4, based on the result of the last week and a half. But the race to avoid last was, I think, where a lot of the action was.
Yep. I mean, certainly, as someone who is very involved in that race, it was it was a nail biter at times, and it definitely put a lot of pressure on those matches to try to stay out of the bottom seat.
Yeah, so week 8, the race to avoid last, actually intersected with the other big storyline for me, which is the curse of the dredge deck. I mean, it's become a running joke at this point, but if you go back and you alluded to it earlier, you go back and look at these matches, and we can go ahead and play this video. This is going to be Eric with the dredge deck playing against Bob Maher, who's on Doomsday, and it's just crazy how far ahead this dredge deck is. Look at Eric's board, right? There's like 40 cards in his graveyard. There's a bunch of zombies in play. He actually probably should have been able to win on a second turn, but he wasn't able to sort of flip enough Narcomoebas to have real creatures to sack, so he couldn't get enough zombies to go for the Flamekin Zealot kill. Still, he says go. He's looked at Bob's hand. He knows that Bob can't kill him. He's got a mental misstep as well, so he can stop, the Ancestral or the Ritual or the Duress, and Bob has just got to figure out, all right, I clearly have to win now. If I say go, Eric is just going to kill me. So how does he win from here, right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's going to...
He's just probed, right? You're Bob Maher. You cast Gataxian Probe. You see that there's a mental misstep in Eric Froehlich's hand.
So I assume you want to... So if you just go for Duress and a Dark Ritual or Doomsday, you're dead, because you have no mana left floating, so that does not win. So you actually have to resolve Ancestral to win this game.
Right, but...
So you have to just Duress and play Ancestral, or you can just lead Ancestral and hope he doesn't misstep it, but that seems crazy. So I think...
the question for me is, does he misstep Dark Ritual, which I still don't know the answer to, because it's not the line that Bob takes. But I think Eric would misstep a Dark Ritual here.
Yeah, snap misstep it. And I think the ritual has residual value because now you can find something like Mox Jet instead of action. So I think it's better to duress. So hit the duress into Ancestral and then hope to hit like Lotus Gush.
All right. Well, Bob agrees with you. Bob goes for the duress. He knows this is just going to get a mental misstep, but he has to clear the mental misstep because his only hope is to get super, super lucky off this Ancestral Recall. Here's the Ancestral. Does that count as getting super lucky off the Ancestral?
That'll also do it.
My notes for this match are Dredge is cursed, a.k.a. Bob's Savage Top Deck.
I ended up doing something very similar to Ifro also in this split, again in Doomsday vs. Dredge, where I also have like a duress backup for the combo in a spot where I have to have it. It's on like turn 2 or something gross. Yeah. So, yeah, Ifro just got completely outdrawn by his opponents in this split. And when I was playing Dredge in the first trimester, it felt the same way. I had a spot against Pakula where I had to hit a discard outlet or like I was like on a 9-outer on a Dredge 7 with 30 cards in my library.
Sure.
And I bricked. And so, it's cruel. It's cruel when that happens.
Yeah, so that was Pedal into Dark Ritual, into Yawgmoth's Will, bring back the Pedal. He's got a Fast Bond hiding in his graveyard, which was the first thing Eric used a mental misstep on way back before we tuned into the video. So yeah, Bob is able to, he's going to sack the Pedal here for the Fast Bond. There's 2 fetch lands in his graveyard. So he's basically able to get the full-on Storm Tendrils kill here.
Yep.
I don't know. Is it fun to watch horrible things happen to Dredge players? Or should we just move on to the next one? Yeah, the way this plays out is, I mean, Bob's got, I think he Ancestrals first. He's going to come up with he's going to come up with the ability to get a Gush, and then, yeah, goes and finds the template. So we can stop that video. Just insane things. I feel like Eric probably should have won on his own second turn. And then even when he says go, his odds of winning that match, even when he says go, are still, what, 80%?
Oh,
higher?
Way higher. Like astronomical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, no, Dredge is cursed. So Bob winning that match meant we did not have the clean match for last. If Bob had lost there, it actually would have been David against Bob just for the relegation spot. But instead, it was David trying to beat Bob to drag Bob and Steve and potentially as many as 3 other players into a last place tie. But Bob beat his good buddy David Williams. So we can actually throw up the final standings, see how things wound up at the end of this trimester. Clean cut for last place, David Williams at 2 and 7, and actually clean cut for 9th too, which surprised me a little bit. Basically, all of those players at 4 and 5 started the week at 3 and 5. But
can we cut back to the trimester summary? Do we have that too?
Yeah, I have got that momentarily. So there's your playoff bracket, and here's trimester 3. So Merfolk and Doomsday were the ones that ran the table, and of course, there's Dredge hanging out at 0-3. You're looking for something in particular here?
I just think you can kind of see the archetypes and kind of see the evolution of the way the season has played out. And I think it's also interesting to note, we had a couple new decks being played here: Punching Pyromancer, Bug Still, and what I think has been a theme in VSL is getting adventures in your deck building has been very heavily punished.
If you count Dredge as adventurous, then I definitely agree with you.
Yeah,
it's like being adventurous and or playing Dredge. I rolled up all the archetypes, actually. We can look at that next if you want.
Oh, awesome.
There's a lot of decks that did well, and then there's Mentor and Dredge providing free wins to feed everybody else's records. It's a little more, I don't know, spread out than maybe you would expect from a graph like this.
Well, Coach, I mean, I expect a format that has such a high power level to be pretty polarized and there to be, just best decks. And I think we're somewhat seeing that here. That the power level of these decks can definitely concentrate, and you get a really steep curve.
Yeah, Dredge did. This is the regular season standing, so Dredge is 0-9. It does get to 0-10 in the playoff tiebreaker anyway.
Yep.
I don't know, the Mentor at 2-10 And especially Menendian going 1-5 with it. Like, Menendian's the one guy that ran it back in the third trimester, and he still only managed to get the one win between 2 sessions.
So, predicting today, jumping ahead now to the finals, are we going to see
Okay.
Dredge played?
I'm going to guess no. I definitely had Ifro with a decent chance of playing Dredge, though, in the quarterfinals. I know when I was thinking about Ifro, I did not cheat on Dredge cards in my sideboard because, look, Dredge is 0-10, but Eric's a math guy, right? Eric's not the kind of guy who's going to believe in the curse.
Of course not.
Now, maybe that starts to add up to evidence that, Dredge doesn't give you the ability to leverage your skill as much as some other decks, maybe. Maybe people in VSL are better at playing against Dredge than your average sort of random vintage player off the street, maybe. Some of it is clearly luck, but 09, like, what's its expected value? It'd be hard to convince me that Dredge was supposed to be a winning deck from 09.
Oh, I feel very strongly that Dredge should be a winning deck in the way that if you go back and watch the 9 matches, I think on expectancy goes 5-4 or 6-3.
Wow. So do you think we'll see Dredge today?
I don't know. It's not really a deck I think that is in Chris's wheelhouse. So I'd be surprised if Chris kind of picked, especially Chris flying back from a PTQ. Hasn't been spending. He's been focused on standard, trying to qualify for the Pro Tour, not trying to brew vintage decks. So I don't think we're going to see Chris really expand his range. He'll probably pick decks from the decks he's familiar with. Ifro could go that direction, but I'm not sure why. Like, I think if you think it's a good deck but not a great deck, there are other choices that are also good decks, not great decks, that do let you leverage play skill, and so you can just go in that direction instead.
Yeah, I think you can convince me that it's a good deck, but I do not think you can convince me that it's a great deck. I think the 09 evidence adds up to it's not great.
Yeah, I don't know. I think 9 matches is such a small sample in the scheme of things, right? Dredge has been played thousands of times in Vintage globally. It's won lots of tournaments. It went undefeated last season. So I would hesitate to really put a lot of weight on the 09.
All right, I got another video for you. I do have the video from the tiebreaker match between Eric and Luis. So Eric goes 0-3 with Dredge. From 6-3, he drops into being tied for second place. He clinched the playoffs before we even got to the third trimester. Runs back the Dredge deck. He's like, I got so unlucky. I've got to be fine here, right? So if you look at this hand, Luis has a Dak and a Mox Pearl, right? He kept a hand that had just Black Lotus for mana and didn't get super far. So Eric has now got his deck doing what his deck does, right? Bizarre, discarding Stinkweed Imps, he's dredging, he's Narcomoebaing. He's even got the Cabal Therapy to be able to go make sure Luis doesn't do anything ridiculous. So he's got this, right?
Well, you can see he's hit 0 copies of Bridge from Below. Right, so he's certainly not having a great draw at this stage of the game.
Okay. What do you yeah, the way this match plays out is just insane to me. Because Eric has essentially the ability to strip Luis's hand, and he's even got the ability to dread return back an Ingot Chewer. 3 copies of Bloodghast come out alongside that Mana Confluence. I think mostly this is just an opportunity to rubberneck at how insane Luis Scott Vargas's draws can be from time to time. Missteps the first copy of the Cabal Therapy. Again, it's a draw where Eric, if things had gone well, might have been able to win on a second turn. Things go, they're kind of going okay. Like you said, no copies of Bridge from Below yet. Still, he's totally going to be able to win on his third turn.
Yep.
Only has to fade 1 turn 2 from Luis Scott Vargas. Cabal Therapy, I think he decides to take the Tinker here to make sure there aren't any Time Vault shenanigans that are coming to play. And this is the tiebreaker game for the 2 seed. So the winner gets the bye into the semis. Cabal Therapy winds up taking the Tinker, I'm pretty sure. Oh, so that was the Cabal Therapy to see what's actually in Luis's hand. And then he's going to go back. He's going to flash it back out of the graveyard.
Yep.
Do you have much experience with the slow dredge deck that doesn't have the dread return for Zealot?
No, but that sounds not good to me. Like, I think Zealot's like the best thing you have going.
It certainly speeds you up. I think the idea with the slow dredge deck is that you can destroy their hand. You don't need to win on turn 2 because you can just destroy their entire hand.
Like, but what additional hand destructions is it playing?
That's a fair question.
Right? Like, these versions already have 3 or 4 unmasks and 4 Cabal Therapies.
You play more unmasks than most people do. I think you're actually almost headed toward that direction with your unmasks. I don't know that Eric has any unmasks in his list. I know yours always did, but I'm not sure everybody else.
Yeah, I always played 3. I played 2 or 3, and I always it was matchup specific, like what I thought people would be playing, how many I played. Kept considering 4 and kept not pulling the trigger. But I think you really want to have access to that explosive.
All right. So it's Luis Scott Vargas. What does he do? He top decks Grafdigger's Cage because of course he does. And he even had another Mox and a Time Vault sitting on top with the deck fading. It's just Eric can't win. The dredge deck can't win. I don't know. I mean, this game winds up lasting forever, and Luis draws not just Grafdigger's Cage. He also draws the second Grafdigger's Cage. Only had 2 in his sideboard. He also draws both copies of Ravenous Trap that he has in his sideboard. It's almost like a submission victory. Like, literally, he decks Eric.
Yeah, that can happen. I mean, same spot, right? I mean, in week 1 against Bob drew his 1 Ravenous Trap. The turn he had to draw it against me.
Bob was not using Dak Faden to target Eric just to make Eric draw 3 cards a turn, which is how this game actually plays out. We can stop watching the video now. It takes forever, but it's pretty funny if you want to watch the Dredge Curse. So that drops Eric into the quarterfinal match. He gets paired against me in the quarters, where he declines to play the Dredge deck and just absolutely obliterates me. I managed to win 1 game from him. I did not win a match. Eric goes to the semifinals, where he gets vengeance against Luis. Luis does manage to win 2 games, still can't win a match. So Eric's season at this point is bookended with 6-0. Then there's the Dredge experiment, and then there's another 6-0 in the playoffs.
He's due for another 0-3, right, to keep the symmetry.
Oh, you think it's an 0-3? I don't know where the symmetry goes from.
I don't know. That would be symmetrical, right? And if you look at it.
Well, it was 0-4 was Dredge, technically. I'm not sure if build a complete symmetry.
So he'll lose the first round of next season to keep it clean. But I don't know. I think in this format, having Dredge as a weapon in the 2 games where you get to pick your deck is kind of interesting. It forces your opponent to kind of stay honest. And I think the temptation in this is to really shave. You don't want to have all 3 of your decks have a full complement of Dredge sideboard cards. I think that's just a lot of slots being taken up.
Maybe.
And so it makes this kind of interesting tool for the rock, paper, scissors of games 4 and 5. So I think it's certainly a reasonable choice in this format.
Yeah, no, I think Dredge is a reasonable choice in a format like this. I don't know that you're ever going to have enough information to know whether your opponent has enough sideboard cards, though. It's maybe, I guess you could learn that, yes, they have decks with tons of Dredge hate because you get beaten by them. But it's hard to know that they're soft to it, right?
Sure.
Now, let's talk about the other sort of super sideboard relevant deck in this matchup, which is the Blue Belcher deck. I mean, Chris 3-0'd the first trimester with Blue Belcher. Blue Belcher, we saw in the archetype standings, it went 7-2 on the year, right? The worst session anybody had with it was 2-1. Mm-hmm. Like, is Chris supposed to run back the Blue Belcher deck here?
Again, it's certainly a good option. The fact that it's so bad against shops, and you know that Eric is very likely playing shops as one of his 3 decks, he's just played it so much, would make me a little scared. Because again, rock, paper, scissors works out poorly, and you just have I'm not sure it's unwinnable, but a very bad matchup.
It's very bad. It's, it's like 85-15 probably.
Yeah.
Maybe it's 80-20.
And I'm not sure it's good matchups are comparably good. Maybe they are. I mean, but...
So in my mind, the Blue Belcher deck is favored against every other deck, but then it's 85-15 dog to the shops.
But how big of a favorite is it against the other decks?
Oh, like 60-40. 55,
okay, so
55-45, 65-35, depending. It's not... I don't know. Against Dredge, it's actually like legitimately 70, 80%, maybe even 90% favored. Because the thing is, you have all these time twister effects. You're just randomly pre-sideboarded against Dredge. So you're faster than them, and your natural strategy completely obliterates their graveyard strategy.
Sure.
So the Dredge matchup is insanely good for Belcher. If you think you're in a field with a bunch of Dredge, you absolutely want to run Belcher. But like against the blue decks, no, you're on, I think you're favored against Delver and Mentor type decks, but you're whatever, 55, 60%. You're not, oh my God, favored.
Right. So 1/3 of the time you have 15% equity, and 2/3 of the time you have 60% equity, ignoring Dredge. I think works out to like not a great deck choice for this format.
Yeah, the fact that Eric is, almost certainly going to have a Shops deck might make it where Chris can't run Belcher.
Exactly. That's my thinking.
This is exactly where I was going into the quarters. And you know what? I knew he was going to run a Shops deck. I just couldn't bring myself to not run Belcher. The deck is just so much fun, and I've had so much success with it that I ran it anyway. And literally, I rolled dice to place my decks, A, B, and C. Like, I wasn't going to try to get into this, like, where's Eric going to place his Shops deck in the lineup? I just randomized it. And randomly wound up putting my Belcher deck second and ran it into Eric and Workshops.
Right. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get there. Is they say if 1/3 of the time you have 15% equity and 2/3 of the time you have 6% equity, that's not a great spot to be in for the overall match. So you're probably going to, on average, you're coming out as a loss from having that as one of your 3 decks. So I think it's risky to have Belcher in the mix here when you think that there's likely to be Shops.
Begrudgingly think I have to agree with you, which is too bad. But we can look at the bracket and see how we get set up to the finals. Sort of the last piece of our season in review. We talked through all the trimesters. We talked through the playoffs. Eric obliterates me after losing the tiebreaker and getting stuck in the quarterfinal match. No problem. Who needs a bye? 3-0 defeats me. 3-0 defeats Luis Scott Vargas. And here we are. Finals time. Chris Bakula versus Eric Froelich.
I think we have the players are getting ready, is my guess. I think we're going to have, preparing themselves mentally for the battle ahead.
Yeah. So your prediction was Eric Froelich, just one of the best players in the world, #1 ranked in the world, and how can you pick against him?
Yeah, my prediction is Eric in 4 games, in 4 matches, 3-1.
Reasonable. Yeah, my heart wants to root for Chris. We had the Belcher deck that we kind of shared. He's had, he did have the PTQ failure yesterday. I mean, failure. He went 4-2 and probably made, one mulligan decision that I know he regrets. Did not manage to qualify himself from the Pro Tour yesterday. My heart wants to say Chris, but yeah, Eric is just, he's kind of insane right now.
He's on a roll, and I do think, Chris just flew back. He's, that just, it definitely affects your mental state a little bit.
Yeah.
Hopefully Chris has some time to kind of just get home, relax a little bit, prepare himself. But I think the intangibles are definitely against him. And I think that, at the end of the day, Eric is just a better player. I think even Chris would say that. Eric
I would say that Chris has more experience with Vintage.
Yeah, I
saw Steve Menendian.
That matters a lot myself.
Well, you saw Steve Menendian beat Luis in the finals last year.
Yeah, I think if you run that finals 10 times, Luis wins it 7 or 8 of them. So again, I don't think that also.
No one's going to suggest that Steve Menendian's a better Magic player than Luis Scott Vargas, but Menendian he's played as much Vintage as anybody on the planet, and I mean I do think that that's relevant.
Yeah, so I know there's a spectrum here of how much does it matter, like the format specialization versus just being good at Magic fundamentally. Yep. I'm pretty extreme on the end of this format doesn't really matter that much.
Okay.
Barring, if he's never played any games of Vintage, it matters. But Eric's played a bunch this season. He's tested for each week. Yep. He's played certainly the threshold amount to make it not relevant that he's playing Vintage versus another format. I think at this stage.
Fair enough. Any other deck predictions? So you've got Eric on Shops. You've got Chris on probably shouldn't play Belcher. What else do you think we're going to see?
So let me just what were Eric's choices in the last 2 matches? We also have more data, right? He's prepared for this format twice now, and he's picked sets of 3 decks. Could we recap his choices against you and against Luis?
Against me, he had Shops, Doomsday, and Delver. Essentially Delver. It was Mentor Delver somewhere in that space.
Yep.
Against Luis, He had the Delver Shops and Grixis Thieves, for lack of a better name.
My guess is he has close to the same three decks he played against you. He'll play against Chris. I think that's the most likely three. We've seen him play a lot of Delver and have tremendous results with it. I think it's a deck that really rewards his familiarity with Delver across other formats as well. I think Eric's a great Delver player. He's shown that he thinks Shops is one of the pillars of the format, and I think he'll definitely have it as one of his three as a tool to bring out in those final two matches. And then I think Doomsday might be the best deck in Vintage. I know Luis
Yeah,
feels similarly.
I do too. I'm surprised Eric didn't run it against Luis, honestly.
So yeah, my guess is that he'll bring it back for this and just play the objectively what he considers to be probably the most powerful deck in Vintage. So I think those will be his three choices. And Chris, his third deck is a toss up for me because I think he'll bring back Fish and Shops because that's what he's played so much.
Okay.
In the regular season, and I don't know what his third deck will be because I think playing Belcher's a risk, but it could certainly be Belcher.
Yeah, no, Fish Shops Belcher are, the three best performing decks of the season, and the three decks that he's run. I kind of agree with you on Belcher. So I guess if you wanted the decks that did the best in the season, you'd swap Oath in instead of the riskier Belcher deck.
And Chris has a lot of strong connections to some of the Vintage deck builders, and one area where I think it is relevant is in deck selection.
Yeah.
Being more tied in the Vintage community gives you more access to deck lists, and you just know more what's going on. So where I think in actual playing out games, it doesn't matter a lot that one player's played is a Vintage specialist, one's not. It does matter for deck building, and so I think Chris could surprise us with a third deck that he's gets from one of these guys who is just has really tuned lists. So something like an Oath list could be in that category.
Right. Yeah. His build of Merfolk was actually a Joe Lim build of Merfolk, where he didn't run any Null Rods. He ran Chalice of the Void instead. Believing that in a field, especially in a Delver-heavy field, being able to Chalice 1 against Delver is just kind of insane.
Sure, and it wouldn't surprise me to do that here if he expects, like we're saying here, if we're playing decks like Doomsday and Delver, both those decks definitely have a problem with Chalice. So I like a shell for Fish out of Chris.
Fair enough. How close are we? Yeah, players are getting their hand cam set up.
Oh, awesome. I know. So there's been a lot of discussion that I've seen take place about how good the Fish versus Shops matchup is.
Yeah.
And it probably depends on which Shops build we're talking about. I've mostly seen it actually talked about because you have played Chris in that matchup, I think, twice now. Both times against Chris's version of Shops. How do you feel about that matchup in general? And then how do you feel about it against the more, I think it's called Martello Shops, no relation to me, version that Chris plays, that Ephro plays?
I'm okay being on the Merfolk side of that matchup because I think that if you can ever get True Name Nemesis into play, there's nothing they can do about it. They don't win fast enough to race True Name Nemesis. And if you can get it into play, the other thing, if you can get it into play, if you can sort of ever get to 3 mana, then you have this really hard for them to deal with threat. The other thing is that Cavern of Souls actually beats Chalice. So they can't lock you out from playing Merfolk. If they Chalice 1 or Chalice 2, you'd think that just destroys your ability to play the game, but Cavern of Souls beats Chalice. Chalice says it counters the spell, and Cavern says it can't be countered. So you've got more game than you'd think. It's not like it's a good matchup. I still think you need a lot of sideboard cards if you want to be a favorite.
Okay.
But, if you're willing to sideboard, 4 1-mana counters, whether they're nulls or steel sabotages, I think you can have it where the matchup is actually favored on the Merfolk side.
And the Delver matchup is quite good for Merfolk, right?
The which?
The point of the deck, Delver against Merfolk.
Oh yeah. No, you're great against the combo decks. Especially, you're great against anybody who's punished by Null Rods. So Belcher is insanely good for you. You're very good against the Delver decks. You're extremely good against the Mentor decks because they're like slower versions of Delver, or at least more vulnerable to mana disruption. And your Shots matchup is okay. You get obliterated by Dredge, and you get obliterated by Oath. That's the bad side.
Okay. Because I was thinking if I'm Chris, I might actually submit Fish Shops and double play Merfolk in the first 3 rounds. Because I think it's pretty good against the range that we expect Ephro to be playing.
Okay.
And I think it's a deck that he has a ton of experience with, and he's really comfortable playing these matchups.
Interesting.
And it's like, what else would he play over the second copy of Fish? I don't want to play Belcher if I'm him. Maybe you play Delver, but I think I would, if I'm Chris, I'd rather play Merfolk than Delver. So why not just play Merfolk twice? And having the Merfolk and Workshops as your two decks going to the final two matches, they're so opposite that it's really hard for Ephro to dominate you. Whereas if you just swap out a fish for a Delver, for instance, it doesn't really change Ephro's thinking for his deck selection in the final two matchups, whether it's fish Delver shops or fish shops. I think it might be a really interesting strategic decision. We haven't seen anyone do this, right? No one submitted only two decks.
Right.
But I think it could be the right call here.
Well, I mean, if by submitting two decks, you're not helping yourself at all. You have the flexibility to play effectively a two-deck mix in match 4 and match 5 anyway.
Right. But if you think your two decks are just dominant, again, have a good range against his three deck selection of the first three, you can come out 2-1 or even 3-0 those by playing the deck twice instead of playing a deck you think is just weaker and being a dog in one of those three matchups. If it doesn't really give you a better kind of mix in the last two matches, I think it's an interesting trade-off there.
Yeah, no, I actually saw Eric joke that he would have considered Dredge against me in the quarterfinals, except the problem with that is I get to play whatever my best anti-Dredge deck is in match 4 and match 5.
Right. You can just tee up against them. I think you can't do a 3Xing is really dangerous because then they know exactly what you're doing in match 4 and 5.
Exactly.
You don't want to go 3-0. You can go 2-1. I think that's a very reasonable choice. But yeah, I think 3-0ing is just going too far.
Sounds right.